Hey, welcome back, everybody. To be part of this intro to nursing elections EMG. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, just a reminder that a couple of things. One is the goal of these two talks is to help prepare us for the hands-on experience that we're going to have in the next couple of weeks. That's for the PGY 3s and 4s, PGY 2s and 1s. Don't worry, your time will come next year. It's just that there's a limited number of machines and of us. So we decided to divide it. The second thing is just a reminder that I did send you everybody questions, 4 questions. Tonight is by midnight, that's the deadline. To send responses. Many of you have, some of you haven't. Please send them. You don't want to get from me a love letter saying fail tomorrow morning, which I will do. So go over those questions and answer them. By the way, if you listen carefully to these two talks, you'll be able to easily answer those 4 questions in 5 minutes. Anyway, what we're going to do today is the second part, which is to talk about EMG. And hopefully YouTube is going to work, and hopefully you guys like watching YouTube because that's what we're going to use for our talk. So what are we talking about? Okay, I'll just use this. Doesn't matter. Okay. So this is the needle part. Remember yesterday we talked about nerve connections where we had a stimulator and reporting electrodes, so we're testing the nerves. Now we're testing the muscle. Basically, we're sticking a needle electrode into the muscle and report the electrical activity in the muscle. Common mistake is to think that yesterday we were testing the nerves and today we're testing the muscles. No, both tests give us information about the neuromuscular system. And there's a lot of overlap and a lot of information that we gain from each part of the studies. Just an example, severe radiculopathy, we will know that it's severe when we actually have findings of the EMG, okay? Which is obviously a nerve problem. So don't think that those are separated into different diseases. These are 2 components of the same test. We call it EMG. That's kind of how in the street we call the test, but just remember there are 2 parts to the test. Going back to the most basic term that we have to think about is the motor unit. Yesterday we defined it. What's the definition of the motor unit?
Muscle fibers that are innervated by one neuron.
Exactly. So for those of you in Zoom that didn't hear, Jack, so it's all the muscle fibers innervated by one neuron. Okay, so one neuron, and here we have 2. So here we have motor unit number 1, motor unit number 2. So the green innervates all the muscle fibers that are in green, and conveniently all the muscle fibers in blue are innervated by the motor unit number 1. So we have 2 motor units here that we're looking at. So during this talk, we're going to shift to this basic schematic representation. Obviously, this is not real life, but it's just going to help us understand what are the different variations. So this is a normal, when you look at this, this is a normal motor unit. So what does it mean that this is a motor unit, normal motor unit? We have a nerve here, and we have an axon, and from the axon, we have derivatives which innervate each a muscle fiber. So those are, just to remind you, what are muscle fibers? Those are individual cells within the muscle itself. So it's not individual muscles, those are individual cells within the muscle. Okay? Each cell is a muscle fiber, okay? And each one of them is innervated by an extension of an axon from one neuron, okay? So in this case, these are the neurons that sit in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, right? That's the lower motor neuron that we're discussing. And on the bottom here, what you'll see during the talk is the electrical representation of what we see if we stick a needle electrode next to that motor unit, what we would see. In this case, we have a normal, this is how a normal motor unit will appear. If you notice, there are three deflections here. Downward, which to confuse us is called positive. Upward, to confuse us, called negative. And then another downward deflection. So three deflections, down, up, and down. Okay, so positive, negative, positive. And this is a normal electrical representation of a normal unit where we stuck the needle exactly close to the kind of ideal situation where we stuck the needle right here, close to the unit. We have an electrical field close to the needle, underneath the needle, and then away from the needle. And that's what we basically see here in the on the screen, on the oscilloscope. All right, and here is what we saw earlier, just a little bit expanded. We call the different deflections phases. But you will see in books that phases, so the correct definition of a phase is when it crosses the baseline here. You see on top here, there are also deflections, which we didn't see earlier. This is a bit abnormal, but not abnormal enough to actually get the name of a phase. So you see the numbers here, we have 1, 2, and 3. So those on top are abnormal, but not abnormal enough for us to call it that there's more than the three basic phases over here. So when you count phases, remember that it has to cross the baseline. So in this case, we have 1, 2, and 3 phases. When we analyze further the unit, we look at the amplitude of the unit. But more importantly than anything is the duration of the unit. How much time from the beginning of the electrical impulse to the end of the electrical impulse. And we'll see in a moment, in a few moments, why this is important. All right, so now hopefully this will work. We'll start by showing, we'll get back to this again. Start by showing a normal unit.
1 in 3 people will have cancer.
All right, there's going to be some advertisements. I'm not getting any percentage from these. Okay. So when we're looking at these graphs, notice what we see, but very importantly, what we hear. Okay. So here on the top, we see the run of the EMG on the oscilloscope. Basically, we stuck the needle and we're recording, and we see these waveforms. In this case, this is a normal unit. You see the downward, upward, downward, upward deflection. Looks like normal. Over at the bottom, there's a way to catch them. Doesn't matter how, but we can trigger them so we can catch them. And in this case, we just look at the individual one, and it actually can put many of them one on top of the other. So that's what we see at the bottom here. And this just helps us analyze it, because when it runs on the screen here at the top, sometimes it runs so fast that it's hard for us to analyze all the features that we talked about, the phases, the width, the amplitude. So we try to catch them by a trigger, and then we can analyze them here at the bottom. But importantly, also not only look at them in terms of phases and those attributes, but listen to them. So let's.
Dr. Perk, I don't think the Zoom people are getting this screen.
They're not seeing it?
No, we're not seeing the screen, Dr. Perk.
Hold on.
So what do I have to do that
They
at
can
the
see.
time?
Now we can see, yeah.
Then we have to switch back.
All right, this is going to be interesting. Okay, so what I was showing earlier is this is a normal unit. On the top, you just see it. You'll see it in a moment, just running. And here we're catching them, so we can analyze them, each individual unit. Look at the phases, the width, and the amplitude. But what I was saying earlier is also try to listen to it. What you listen here is kind of a mid-range thump, not very high frequency, not very low. So just put that in your hard drive because we'll hear later on variations on the theme. So this is a normal unit. Okay, now notice that it's pretty rhythmic. In other words, it's not random. So we're basically asking the patient to give some effort, very, very minimal effort. They're giving that very minimal effort and the unit is firing and we're hearing that kind of low, lowish amplitude thump. Okay. So now let's see if we can go back to the
Share again, you share.
Should be able to do this sharing the desktop like when it switches. Honest, you should be able to make it so that the desktop is on.
we just share both, so we don't have to waste time on this.
Can you guys see it?
Can you see back the PowerPoint?
No. Select screen.
Yes, share screen. Yeah, that's just.
Okay, so now they'll see whatever I see, what we
Yeah.
see. Okay. All right, so that's a normal motor unit. That's kind of the basic currency that we're going to look at. Okay. Now we have to think of what are the things that we want to analyze when we look at a strip like that. So there are 3 steps that we look into. One is called spontaneous activity, activity that happens on its own without us asking the patient to do anything. That's called spontaneous activity. So we stick a needle in and there's activity going on. Normally, in the majority of cases, we'll show in a moment a situation where that's not the case. Normally, we should not have any spontaneous activity from a normal muscle. Later on, we look at the motor unit itself. That's what we did earlier. We analyze the motor unit itself. We're looking at it, how large it is, how does it sound to us, how many phases, and so forth. And then we'll explain the different variations. And then the third aspect is recruitment patterns. Recruitment patterns means that when we need more force, how does the body recruit more motor units? And we'll get into more details on that. So there are 3 steps, and we'll start with the first step, which is spontaneous activity. Now, I just said that in the majority of cases, spontaneous activity is abnormal. But there is a situation where spontaneous activity is normal, and that is when you stick a needle and you happen to fall on exactly the place where the neuromuscular junction exists. Okay? And why is that? If you remember from physiology, there's continuous discharge of vesicles from the terminus of the nerve down the neuromuscular junction, hitting the postsynaptic membrane and creating what's called miniature potentials. Those happen spontaneously all the time, and they're probably important for the maintenance of the muscle. Okay? But they do not achieve threshold. They're not enough to activate the muscle. So those are continuous all the time, but they're not enough to reach the threshold to actually activate the muscle. They don't reach, they don't create an action potential. Okay. And they have a very distinct sound. Everything that we kind of hear, we kind of try to give it a representation in our mind so it's easy to remember. It sounds like waves on seashells. So look for the waves on seashells. That's how it sounds. By the way, it hurts the patient when you go there with a needle. That's one of the ways to know that that's where you are. because they'll complain. It's for some reason it's painful, so you just pull the needle away, and then they feel more comfortable. So let's see if this works. So there are two types here. There are there are spikes here and the seashells, the miniature potential. So it's a little bit hard to distinguish them. Both of them are the same. We won't go into the physiology of why one and the other, but both of them are basically those discharges that happen because of release of acetylcholine that reaches the membrane, but not enough to reach threshold. And so you'll hear those kind of sharp spikes and in between the seashells. So now we're in an area of seashells. So listen to the seashells. By the way, those spikes, I'll just convince you that they are not normal units. You see how thin they are? And they don't have the three phases. Now you're world experts. You know that there should be three phases. There should be a deflection downward, upward, downward. We don't see it here. Those are not normal motor units. These are end plate spikes. Okay, and they have kind of this distinct sharp sound, but in the background, try with all of this motion outside, try to hear for the seashells, the waves over seashells. Let's see if I can convince you. You can also think of this hum as, you know, there are these large seashells that you put on the, as kids, you put on the ear and hear this kind of hum. That's also a description. So listen to that, kind of the rumble in the back. This hum should not be there. It shouldn't be there. If it's kind of static, those are the spikes. They're very, very sharp. They don't, later on, we'll go back to the normal unit. You already heard the motor unit, the normal motor unit. It had kind of a lower frequency. In this case, it's much sharper. So sharp, and in the background,
It's more like an airplane background.
okay, some humming in the background. Whatever works for you to remember. So airplane hum.
Airplane.
Okay. So now we're going to go to discuss not normal spontaneous activity. We said that the first thing that we do when we stick a needle in, so we have three steps. The first is spontaneous activity that we're looking for. The second is reanalyze the units, and the third is recruitment. So we're going back to spontaneous activity this time to what is abnormal. We gave an example of what would be normal in the case that we kind of hit the jackpot, hit the lottery, and got the needle exactly on the neuromuscular junction. It happens. You do it enough, it happens. But if you don't go there, a normal muscle should be silent. Should be silent. There shouldn't be spontaneous activity. Now, there are several examples of spontaneous activity. The one that I want you to really remember, more importantly than anything else, are what's called fibrillations and positive sharp waves, because they are a very common thing that we look for when we're looking for a question if we have denervation. So what are we basically looking for? So here we have a motor unit. I should trigger warning. This is going to be a sad story. Okay. So do you guys on Zoom can see the screen? Oh.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. So back to our sad story. So here we have mom and her kids. And all the kids are connected to mom. I told you, trigger, it's a sad story. Mom dies. Okay, that happens. Not my fault, that's what happened. Dies. So what happens to the kids? they lose the connections. They become orphaned. So what happens to an orphan? They're in shock. For 2 weeks, they're just stunned. They don't do anything. They just sit there and do nothing. After 2 weeks, they realize no one's here to tell us what to do. It's very sad, but no one is here to tell us what to do. So we can do our own thing. Turns out, if they don't have this connection, they can do their own thing. No one's there to judge them. And what they do is they have these action potentials, spontaneous action potentials, which appear to us as either fibrillations or positive sharp waves. Both of them have exactly the same meaning. They look differently for physiological reasons. They look differently, they sound a little bit differently, but they mean the same thing. Those are individual muscle fibers that lost their connection with their neuron. So now they're orphaned and they're all alone. Don't worry, there's a happy ending to this. They're not going to stay all alone forever, but for the time being, for the next several months, they're on their own. Okay? So how does it sound like? First of all, this is how they look like. Now, it looks big, but it's just because we expanded the view here. They're tiny because these are individual muscle fibers. On the left, we see how it looks like, how a fibrillation looks like. And on the right, a positive sharp wave. So starting with the fibrillation, you already see that it looks abnormal. It doesn't look like a normal motor unit, right? We have only 2 deflections, downward and upwards, and that's it. And it's very small. In the positive sharp wave, you only see the positive deflection. Remember, positive downward, okay? Now, how does it sound? First of all, they're very faint. It's hard to hear them, but they sound like, no, you're not going to believe my description, but after the success of the seashells, but they sound like raindrops on a tin roof. Okay, that's what you need to listen to. Raindrops on a tin roof, okay? After they'll persuade us to go to Memorial Sloan Kettering and stuff. Or make fire and live up. Okay. Notice that there are 2 sounds here, if you listen carefully. There are the raindrops and then there are large raindrops, okay? They're a little bit, they're the ones with the high pitch, those are the fibrillations, and then the positive sharp waves, which are a little bit wider, they have a lower pitch, so those are like larger raindrops. But if you listen carefully, it all sounds like kind of pouring rain outside. How romantic if you. Now freeze the screen. Here we see, you see how tiny they are? This is a fibrillation, positive sharp wave fibrillation, possibly another fibrillation, very tiny. Another example. Now, in this case, there's an overwhelming number of positive sharp waves, which have kind of the lower frequency to them. So they sound like more thumps. Occasionally, you'll hear a raindrop here and there, but remember, they mean the same thing. Orphaned individual fibers. Really important. Okay, so put that in your kind of hard drive. Again, remember, this is what we see, not immediately. So if we, let's say we're going to a car accident, have a car accident or whatever caused the nerve is cut, and you stick a needle in for about 2 weeks, you're going to hear nothing, no spontaneous activity. This takes time for the fibrillations to understand that they're on their own, for the muscle fibers to understand that they're on their own, and only then they start to fibrillate away. Okay. Now, there is another type of spontaneous activity, which is called fasciculations. Fasciculations happen when we actually activate the whole motor unit in an abnormal way. A fasciculation happens, for example, it could happen, for example, in ALS, when we have disease in the motor neuron, and then we have abnormal activation, spontaneous. We didn't ask the patient to activate their motor unit, and spontaneously these units will pop. It can also happen if we drink too much coffee. It can also happen if you take too much methanol, or even normal amount of methanol. If you take a needle in a muscle of a patient who got methanol, you can see fasciculation. It can also happen normal. Okay, a lot of people have here and there fasciculations, and they ask themselves or myself or Jacob and Jessica, do they have ALS? No, they have too much coffee. Okay, so fasciculations are abnormal spontaneous activity, but they actually have a meaning like ALS only if they're associated with pathology, with muscle weakness. But if you don't have muscle weakness, they're normal. Now, they may have different shapes because this abnormal activation can happen from here, from the nerve, from the nerve pericardium, or it can happen anywhere along the nerve and then spread, which means that, and also this can happen in metabolic situations, and the metabolic trigger can happen anywhere along the nerve. So each one of the bursts can look different. Now they have this very kind of low frequency sound. In this case, listen to popcorn. Okay, popcorn. That's what we're looking at. We are surgeons. Let me see if I can catch one. Yep. There we go. Look how bizarre it looks. First of all, I hope you appreciated the low thumb, like a drum with a low kind of frequency beat to it. It's kind of this popcorn popping, so here and there, and sometimes in a cluster. But look how bizarre it looks like. And the reason that it's so bizarre is because instead of this electricity that we said comes close to the needle, is under the needle, and then away from the needle, this electricity comes from here, from here, from here, goes there, back and forth, because the activation of the motor unit is random. Because we put the nerve the neuron in a soup where it's hyperexcitable. So it can happen anywhere. And if you look closely, we saw different shapes on the screen. Notice how some of them look like this, bizarre, and some look bizarre in a different way. I'll do my best to catch here. So a different shape. So low thumps sounding like popcorn, these are what we call fasciculations. Fasciculations you can see with your eyes. Fasciculations you can see under the skin. Fibrillations you cannot. You cannot see individual muscle fibers twitch. But fasciculations you can. So if you look at a patient with motor neuron disease, if you look carefully, and actually you should, you just look carefully, you wait, and you'll see these twitches of motor units, random motor units. So those are spontaneous activities. Any questions so far? I remember that I always a happy ending to our, well, it's not happy, but it's good ending. And the good ending will come when we talk about the motor unit potential. But in terms of spontaneous activity, so far so good. Everybody understand? Usually abnormal, there is a situations where it's normal, and we gave 2 examples of fibrillations in the positive sharp waves, which are a marker of denervation, and fasciculations, which are a marker of abnormal activation of the motor unit. Okay, so now we're going to analyze motor units. Going back to our famous scheme, here we have a normal motor unit and a normal appearing motor unit on the screen. Now, again, we said that this is an ideal unit where we put the needle right in the middle, right smack in the middle. And what we see is the electricity coming towards the needle underneath, which is maximum, and then goes away. And that's what we're basically seeing. Now, any variation on the number of muscle fibers here will change what we see in terms of the read on the screen, okay? So just going back to normal as our baseline and compare that in your mind to the variations that we'll show. Yeah, we should all use Grammarly. Here's the free version. Okay, normal units. You already heard high pitch, which were the fibrillations. You heard the low pitch thumps of the popcorn of the fasciculations. Now, when you have that under your armor, listen again to the normal units. You'll hear that they're somewhere in the middle. Also, remember, see how rhythmic they are. Okay, they're not random. And look how they appear normal on the screen. Okay. So again, very rhythmic, pump, 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 but not these low frequency thumps of the drum, and not the high pitch raindrops. Okay. And yeah, that's basically what I want to say here. So that's normal. Me let you listen to it again, so you have this kind of normal in your mind. That's normal. Okay. So now we'll start with a situation where we have, in this case, death of the motor fibers, of the muscle fibers. Okay. Let's say we have dermatomyositis or myositis or necrotizing myositis or statin myopathy. Basically, we have, or heroin, or just think of any cause that we have a myopathy in which we lose cells die. Schematically, it will look like this. And what is this? We see the neuron here, and instead of all the kids here connected, we see less kids. Okay? So what do you think will be the size of the motor unit that we record when we put the needle in? Is it going to be larger, the same, or smaller? Smaller. Smaller. Less electricity. And here we actually see it over here. It's much smaller. The other thing about it is that it loses the normal shape. Because it doesn't have this very organized structure of all the muscle fibers around the needle with the waveform first kind of growing up and then maximum under and then goes away. It's pretty random where we lose the muscle fibers in each unit. They could be all very far away from the needle, some close, some far away. Usually it's random, right? And that's why we see this kind of erratic shape. But the important thing about it, that it's small, okay? So we look for small polyphasic units. They may be polyphasic and they're small, okay? Notice that they have a little bit of a kind of sharper sound to them, but also when you look at them here, you see they have smaller amplitude and they have all these phases. So they're small and with multiple phases. They're just erratic and they look different from each other, right? All depending on the relative location of the muscle fibers to our needle. Listen to it again. So they're much smaller than the normal motor units, and the shape is completely different. Okay, when you see this, think of myopathy. Okay, so listen and watch. Okay, higher pitch, polyphasic, very small units. Okay. Those are half of the hallmarks of myopathic units. We'll get to another hallmark at the end. But in terms of the shape of the unit, that's what we're looking for. Okay. Any questions so far? So this is one end. The second part is neurogenesis. Remember I told you the happy ending of the story? So what happened to, we ask ourselves, what happened to the orphaned muscle fibers that lost the connection with the original mom? They're fibrillating away. After 2 weeks of shock, they fibrillate away. But then neighbor mom over here, which is normal, notices these orphans. And what does she do? She adopts them. How does she do it? She sends more of these derivatives from the axons and connects them and incorporates them into the family. So now instead of having 10 muscle fibers in this family, we have almost double or double. I didn't count, double. So what do you think the size of the motor unit will be when we record it? Smaller, the same, or larger? Large, right? The other thing is that it's going to be, again, erratic. It's not going to look normal like this one. It's going to be erratic. Now, it's going to be very large in terms of size, in terms of amplitude, but more importantly, width. And what is the reason? The reason is that we have here new derivatives from the axons which need to myelinate, and this takes time. These are what's called nascent axons, new axons that re-innervate the muscle fibers, and it will take time for them to be incorporated into the family here. And so the original ones will get their action potential and be activated early. But those that were recently incorporated and have demyelinated axons connecting to them will take them a little bit longer. So in the beginning, we'll see the original ones. And then later on, we'll see here, I hope you can see the mouse, you can see the others being incorporated. The interesting thing is that if we follow the same unit over time, the more time elapses, the more myelination happens, and they're more incorporated into the unit. The unit will still be large, will still have a lot of electricity, but you'll see less of this polyphasic polyphasia here. Will be more incorporated into and more synchronous into the original unit. Where do we see it? We see it, for example, in patients who had polio when they were young. So they had the innovation when they were young, and now many decades later, we, for whatever reason, do an EMG. We'll see this gigantic units, but they will have less of these polyphasia. This is also helpful for us. First of all, if we see it, then this is a marker of reinnervation. So we know we're dealing with a neurogenic process. Okay, so for example, this will something we'll see in ALS or radiculopathy that's been going on for a long period of time. It also allows us to give us kind of a sense of when did it happen. The more polyphasic, the more recent. Even though it takes several months for this to develop, if it's more polyphasic, it's more recent. So if we're talking about something that happened 6 months ago, we'll see this. But if we're talking about something that happened 3 decades ago, like polio, it will just appear large, but we'll have less of these polyphasic deflections. So it gives us a little bit of an ability when we do the EMG to give kind of a sense of chronicity, okay? So a situation where we don't have these, but we have only fibrillations, we can say this is somewhere between 2 weeks and 3 months. If we still have fibrillations and start to have these, then we can say, well, it's at least 3 months, right? Or at least a couple of months, because this takes time to develop. If we still have fibrillations, it tells us that either the damage is ongoing or that it's within the 3 months, so not all of the fibrillations, not all of the muscle fibers were incorporated. So just basically, when we look at the screen, when we look at those polyphasic units and we look at the fibrillations, just by looking at the screen, we can tell how long ago the damage happened. So we can say this is an acute lesion, subacute lesion, chronic, and so forth. Okay? So while you're digesting that information, let's see how this actually looks and sounds. This will have a low frequency thud to it, very erratic. And when you look at the screen, you'll see different shapes of the units. That's what you need to look for. Very harsh sound, very strong sound, very big sound, very erratic appearing, polyphasia, up, down, very wide. These are neurogenic units. Or you could say they look also like the myopathic units. Yeah, but it looks like their gigantic brother, right? The myopathic units also had this polyphasia, but they were tiny. They didn't sound like this. Remember, always think of the sound. This is kind of this harsh. Like horse, I'll stop with the those are things that kind of in my mind are helpful to remember, but hoofs on the street. Okay, here they captured several of those kind of in a raster. There's a technique to catch them, to look at the screen, and we can measure when we catch them individually and freeze them. We can actually measure. We can measure the width. We can measure the amplitude. And here you have to believe me that these are very long duration polyphasic units which is in EMG speak, these are neurogenic, chronic neurogenic units, okay? Long duration polyphasic. If you see that in the reports, that means neurogenic. Okay. So here we have the three flavors. How are we doing in terms of? Ooh. So here we have the three kind of flavors when we analyze a unit. Remember, we started the talk with spontaneous activity. Now we're analyzing the unit itself, and we gave two flavors. One is large polyphasic, long duration units, which are neurogenic, and then the small units, which are myopathic. Okay, so this is what we get when we analyze individual units. Okay. So now we're in the last part of the talk, which will be quick, and this is recruitment patterns. So what is, first of all, recruitment? Recruitment, you can think of it as when you recruit your soldiers or your employees to do a task. Okay, so let's say, for example, I need to lift something that is relatively light. Then I don't need to recruit a lot of muscle fibers. But on the other hand, if I try to move this table, which I can't, now I'm trying, in order to do that, I'm recruiting a lot of units. Now, there are two ways that the brain produces force by activating a muscle. One is by increasing the firing rate. Okay, so instead of action potential every, let's say once a second, it can fire 10 times a second. We call it 10 hertz. The number of times in a second is called hertz. So instead of 1 hertz, 10 hertz. Instead of every second, 10 times in a second. Okay? When we fire 10 times in a second, we produce more force. Okay? Because while I'm trying to lift this, the motor unit is going to fire 10 times. It will produce more force. The second way that we're producing force is by recruiting more units. Okay? So the first one was to have the same motor unit fire in a higher rate. And the second, more intuitive, is to call more people to help out. Okay? So instead of using just one motor unit and having it fire in a higher rate, we'll have 10 coming to the task, and they together will produce enough force, hopefully, in order to achieve the task. Now, normally, we have what's called a recruitment ratio. We have one unit that fires, and then when we reach a certain firing rate, that's a signal to incorporate more units. Okay? But there are situations where we don't have others to recruit, which we'll see in a moment. So the poor one unit has to fire very quickly, and it's asking, please come help, but looking around, there's no one there to help. That's when nerves are dead. That's a neurogenic process, and the unit has to fire at a higher rate, but there's no one else that is being recruited. The other possibility of the spectrum is that each unit is very weak. We'll show it schematically in a moment, but each unit is very weak. In situations, for example, where we have a myopathy, where we have dead muscle fibers. So each unit, even if it fires in a higher rate, it's so small that it doesn't produce a lot of force. So it very quickly calls for help. Now, there will be other motor units to join because they're alive. The nerves are alive in a myopathy, except that they're all weak. So they're all going to join force together very, very quickly in order to produce the strength. What we described here in stories, we can actually see on the screen, okay? So here we have a normal situation where we stuck a needle into someone who is completely normal and is relatively at rest, but we're asking them to do very, very minimal action. So just even you tell them, think of moving your finger, okay? You stick the needle in and you see here's a motor unit, and then it's silent, and then we see another motor unit. We won't go into the calculations, but actually, as a fellow, you'll have to look at it and you say immediately how many hertz this is firing, just based on what the screen shows you. But we're not going to go into that. But basically, you can see that infrequently we have the same unit firing. What we learned from this is that we didn't need a lot of force. Okay? Now we're asking the patient to do a little bit more force. Okay, so we're seeing that the same unit here is firing at a higher rate. We see it 3 times on the screen. Well, look what else happened. We see another unit. Okay, remember we can call them by names. This is John. This is Tom. So John is working here, calling for Tom. Tom is coming to help. And then we need more force. Okay, so here is Tom. And then we have Jerry join them because we need a little bit more force. So here we see 3 different units. So we see 2 things happen when we look at the continuation from the top screen to the bottom screen. We see a higher frequency, so each unit fires in a higher rate. We see it more times on the screen. But also, as we increase the force, we see more individual units being recruited. This is normal. Okay.
Was accepted to SGU analysis.
I will have to, next year I'll work on the. I don't know, this is not the one that I asked for. Let's see again. Okay. So what you want to hear here is these are normal units. And then occasionally we'll see increase in the force. You'll hear that the rhythm, that the rate is higher. And when the rate is higher, you'll see on the screen more shapes, okay? So this one is one type, and here we have superimposed 2 other units, I think. We'll see in a moment. So look for sound, and so for the increase in the rate, but also on the screen, you'll see more different appearing units. So here's one, and you'll see in a moment other appearing shapes. Okay, so the higher the rate, the more distinct units that you can see on the screen. And notice that when we ask for in a moment for maximum force, we'll see complete disruption of the baseline, and that's normal. And when you look at the units that disrupted the baseline, they'll all look different, okay? Okay, so we don't see the baseline, and we see a variety of units here. Some are closer to our needle, some are further away from the needle. They all look different, and that is normal recruitment. So higher rate, and when there's a higher rate, we ask for more people to join the course. We're almost done, so don't worry. Okay, when we have a neuropathic pattern, that's the situation where we have a loss of axons or loss of motor units. The remaining motor units have to provide, if they can, as much force as they can. So obviously, if there's a lot of loss of motor units, the patient will be weak, but not hopefully paralyzed initially. So why are they not paralyzed? Because there is still a motor unit that is trying its best by increasing the firing rate to increase the force. Okay, so that's what we see here. We see increase in the rate, but it's the same unit. Okay, increasing the rate, but it's the same unit on the screen. This is called reduced recruitment. Okay, and you'll see it in a moment. It even sounds uniform. So if you compare it to the earlier screen where we increased the rate, right? We had the incorporation of all the other units, the sound changed. But here, if you listen carefully, it sounds almost machine-like. It's very distinct, and look at the screen, they all look the same because it's the same unit. And then when it reaches maximum activation, we call it a picket fence. It's like a picket fence. So they're changing the way we look at it. They're not changing the force here, we're just the way that we're looking at it. This is what's called a picket fence. So basically, one unit is trying to compensate for the loss of its buddies by increasing the rate. So it's the same unit firing at a higher rate. And this is called picket fence. Notice that we have between them back to the baseline. So this appearance is neurogenic. Reduced recruitment. This is how it looks like. The same unit firing at a high rate. Same unit, so picket fence. Okay? Neurogenic process. The other side of the coin, as we said, is when we have the same number of units, but the units themselves in a myopathic situation have lost the muscle fibers. So the neurons are okay. The number of the motor units, normal, but each one of them has less muscle fibers, less force. We need to recruit many of them very early on for minimal force. Okay? So that's early recruitment. Okay? So this is not the reduced recruitment that we had in the neurogenic process. We have early recruitment, and very quickly we have these small units take away the baseline. So first, notice the sound. It's much fainter because these are small units, because they lost members in the family. And notice how immediately the baseline is disrupted, okay? Even at a very initial beginning when we ask the patient to do very little force. These are not the unique picket fence, but there are many, many units, very different kinds. You see the screen is going all over the place. Being recruited to help out. So we see these polyphasic, very small units. And so this is kind of a summary of the three types of recruitment. On the top, we see the normal when we in maximum force. We see disruption of the baseline by a variety of units that came to do the job. We see the situation where we don't have a lot of soldiers and they each do the best they can by working very, very hard. And then at the third one, myopathic, is when we have a lot of number of workers, but they're each weak. So each have to be to come to the aid and try to raise whatever object that we are doing. We'll go into that. Any questions? So just remember there are 3 steps. We first listen to spontaneous activity. The second is we analyze the units. And the third is we look at recruitment. And we talked today about the most common thing that we look for in terms of differentiation, which are neurogenic processes and myopathic processes, and each one with their characteristics. Any questions? All right, any questions on Zoom? Oh, wait, there is a question? Cannot see the video. Okay. All right, reminder, send me your answers to the 4 questions and also please remember to fill the survey.